us. This is Okay, thank you so much for joining us. This is our third teach-in. My name is Gabrielle Opria, and I'm an organizer with Students Supporting UMFA. And before I introduce our speaker today, I am just going to read SS UMFA's land acknowledgement. So, the University of Manitoba, where many of us who gather here today study, is a colonial structure built on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations, who are the first and rightful inhabitants of these lands. The water that sustains us here comes from Shoal Lake. As the first university to be established in what is now called Western Canada, we recognize the university's historical and ongoing role to enable violence and oppression against Indigenous people who have suffered and continue to suffer. Our programs privilege and perpetuate colonial ideologies that value Eurocentric forms and erase Indigenous knowledge systems independent of and existing prior to dominant Western knowledge. Our academic relationships are embedded with power relations structured by colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. It is through the university's ongoing and growing relationship with the neoliberal state and global capitalism that colonization and violence against Indigenous people is inseparable from the academic institution that is now called the University of Manitoba. I will now introduce our speaker, Dr. Julia Smith. Dr. Smith is an assistant professor in the Labor Studies program at the University of Manitoba. She studies the history of labor and feminist activism in Canada. And we will be saving any questions for when we open up discussion following Dr. Smith's talk. But if you'd like, you can type questions in the chat and they'll be raised later on. Dr. Smith, I will pass everything off to you.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here, so bear with me 1 second. Okay, thumbs up. You can see that? Yes, awesome. Okay, I will make it big. Awesome. There we go. We're good to go. So yeah, hi folks. Thanks so much to Gabrielle for that introduction, and thanks to Students Supporting UMFA for organizing these teach-ins, for inviting me to participate, and for all the amazing solidarity work that you folks are doing, including your action today outside the administration building. It's very inspiring, the work you're doing. Thanks too for all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to be here and to have the opportunity to speak with all of you about strikes. So far, these teach-ins have covered a number of big, important issues related to the strike. So last week, Dr. David Camfield talked about capitalism, how it shapes society, where it's taking us, and what we can do about it. And Dr. Megan Sinclair and Dr. David Parent talked about resistance in Native studies and how the issues at the heart of the strike, including recruitment and retention, are negatively affecting Indigenous faculty members in particular. In my talk today, I want to take a step back from these big issues related to the strike and take a closer look at strikes specifically. While some of you may have encountered a strike before or heard about strikes in the news, or even participated in a strike yourself, for others, this might be your first experience with a strike. So given that we're currently in the midst of a strike here at U of M, it's important to have a clear understanding of what strikes are and why workers engage in them. Now, as you've probably noticed, strikes are significant and they're contentious. Strikes often get a lot of news coverage when they occur, and people tend to have strong feelings and opinions about them. One of the reasons why this is the case is because strikes drastically affect social relations. When workers go on strike, they withdraw their labor, they stop working, and this disrupts or even halts the production of goods and the delivery of services. This is why news stories often focus on the inconvenience caused by strikes. And it's true, strikes are inconvenient. They're inconvenient for employers who may lose profits. They're inconvenient for customers who may not be able to access goods and services. They're inconvenient for governments who are concerned with the smooth functioning of the economy. And most of all, they're inconvenient for workers who lose wages and possibly their jobs as a result of a strike. As my colleague, Dr. Sinclair, said in his talk last week, strikes are not fun for anybody. So you're probably thinking, if strikes cause so many problems, why do workers engage in them? That's a good question, and it's one that I look forward to discussing with all of you today. Given the significance of strikes to society and to all of us who are part of the U of M community, it's important that we understand what a strike is and why workers use them. Regardless of your personal feelings about strikes, understanding them historically and today is key to understanding the strike happening right now at U of M and the increase in strike activity that's happening in Manitoba, Canada, and other countries around the world right now. So I'll speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussion. Okay, so let's start by looking at what a strike is. Simply put, a strike is a work stoppage, the concerted refusal of employees to perform work that their employer has assigned to them in order to force the employer to meet certain demands. So it sounds fairly straightforward, right? Well, to understand why strikes are so powerful, we need to situate them within the broader capitalist system. Canada is a capitalist society structured around unequal class relations. That is, under capitalism, employers or capitalists are a relatively small proportion of the population, but they own the vast majority of the wealth, including the means of production, things like factories, stores, tools, and machines. Meanwhile, workers, who comprise the majority of the population, labor in exchange for a wage from their employer. They rely on their wages to buy the goods and services they need to survive. This class relationship is unequal because workers have no choice but to sell their labor. So this puts workers in a subservient relationship to their employers. That being said, a major contradiction of capitalist society is that although capitalists control much of the wealth, the production of that wealth relies on the vast majority, the working class, accepting these conditions. In order to earn a profit, employers need workers to continue to produce goods and services in a timely, uninterrupted manner. This contradiction places a great deal of power in the hands of working people. If workers decide to collectively withdraw their labor, production stops, profits halt, and the capitalist system stalls. What this means is that going on strike, refusing to perform labor, is one of the most powerful tools for workers. Under capitalism, a system that relies on the timely production and sale of commodities to produce profits, employees' refusal to work strikes at the very heart of the system. Now, it's easy, I think, to romanticize the strike as a swift and easy way for workers to win the day. And sometimes it does work out that way. But as we'll see, going on strike is often workers' last resort, and it can lead to conflict and coercion with little chance of success. So we need to look more carefully at strikes and closely examine the pros and cons of different types. Now, technically all strikes share the same common feature, the collective withdrawal of labor, the conscious refusal to work. But how workers go about that differs. Though we often associate strikes with unionized workers and demands for wage increases and better benefits, there are different kinds of strikes, and strikes can be staged by both unionized and non-unionized workers. That's right, you don't have to belong to a union to go on strike. Again, the key aspect of a strike, and this is the important part, is a coordinated and conscious withdrawal of labor by a group of workers to pressure an employer or group of employers or even a government to address a grievance or set of grievances, from an increase in wages and breaks to health and safety issues, or perhaps to show solidarity with other groups of workers. Now, when we think of strikes, many of us probably think of the kind we often see in the news. Generally, these strikes involve workers at one company setting up a picket line outside their workplace after a collective agreement has expired and negotiations have broken down. And this is what's happening at U of M right now. As you may have seen, if you've been to campus recently, striking UMFA members have set up picket lines, which are often a key feature of a strike. A picket line is a boundary established by workers on strike, usually at the entrance to their workplace. It's a visible demonstration that workers have withdrawn their labor, and it's intended to discourage people from entering the workplace to do business or to do the work done by the striking workers. The idea is that a strike and visible picket line will pressure and shame the employer to return to the table and meet employees' demands. Now, picket lines are effective. As a show of solidarity, many people refuse to cross picket lines, including other workers who might usually purchase goods or make deliveries at that workplace. So companies may experience a drop in business as a result of picket lines. So many of us are likely most familiar with the kind of strike that I've just described, but there are several other kinds. So let's take a look at a few of those more closely. A wildcat strike is a work stoppage that is not authorized by the striking workers' union. It's often a spontaneous and unsanctioned protest, and at times, even union leaders will condemn the actions of the strikers, fearing economic sanctions and possibly jail time for them and their members. For example, in 2012, Air Canada baggage handlers and ground staff staged a wildcat strike in solidarity with suspended colleagues. Management had suspended the workers for slow clapping then Federal Labour Minister Lisa Raitt as she walked through Toronto's Pearson Airport shortly after she introduced back to work legislation that forced Air Canada employees to return to work. The spontaneous nature of wildcats often leads to a more raucous and boisterous atmosphere than what we might see on a picket line that's been carefully planned and set up after months of bargaining. As well, union leaders and members don't necessarily support the action as they fear reprisals from employers and the state. Another kind of strike is the sympathy strike. This is when workers walk off the job to support another group of workers already on strike. The goal is to show solidarity with striking workers and to pressure the employer to meet workers' demands, and sometimes to push the government to intervene. For example, in October 2005, the British Columbia division of CUPE engaged in a number of strike actions in support of striking teachers. Reports estimate that more than 11,000 people participated in sympathy strike actions across the province. As with wildcats, though, workers who engage in sympathy strikes can face reprisals from their own unions and employers. The final kind of strike I want to talk about is the general strike. A general strike is a situation where most or all of the workers in a country, province, or city are on strike and are refusing to work. The most famous example in Canada happened right here in Manitoba. The Winnipeg General Strike began in May 1919 and lasted for 6 weeks. At its peak, 30,000 workers were off the job, and their action brought the city to a near standstill. Again, because employers need workers to make profits, when workers withdraw their labor en masse, the entire economy feels the effects. Though Canada hasn't had many general strikes in recent years, they're not a thing of the past, especially if we look beyond Canada to the global context. In 2016, an estimated 180 million workers in India staged a one-day general strike to voice their frustration with proposed government reforms. Unions and journalists described the event as the biggest work stoppage in human history. More recently, in 2019, workers mounted general strikes in a number of countries, including Chile, France, Italy, Hong Kong, Spain, and again, India. So as you can see, the general strike is alive and well as a tool of working class protest. Okay, so as you've seen, there are a variety of strikes, but despite their differences, they all have one thing in common: a collective withdrawal of labor to bring about change. They're disruptive, yes, but for that very reason, they can be effective and powerful tools of resistance and political protest. So now that we understand why workers use strikes and why employers and governments want to avoid them, I want to show you how workers in Canada have used the strike to voice their demands and achieve a variety of changes, and also how the state and employers have sought to contain and limit strikes. So a closer look at the history of the strike in Canada shows us that although many people think of a strike in narrow economic terms, only as a way for unionized workers to get more money, in reality, all kinds of workers have used the strike to protest a variety of issues, both in their workplaces and beyond. As well, the strike has played a pivotal role in shaping the development of the labor movement and labor and employment laws. Throughout the 19th century, workers in what would eventually be known as Canada used the strike to achieve economic and political demands. Irish canal builders struck to protest poor health services and housing conditions, and railway workers struck to protest rising inflation and the increasing price of things like food. Indigenous fishers and cannery workers in BC went on strike to demand better working conditions and an end to racist hiring practices. As well, thousands of workers in cities across central and eastern Canada went on strike to push for the implementation of a 9-hour day in many industries. Now, it's important to note that the strikes of the 9-hour movement were technically illegal because unions were illegal in Canada until 1872. But these strikes helped to pressure the Conservative government of John A. Macdonald to pass the Trade Unions Act of 1872 that formally acknowledged trade unions and made them legal entities. The government didn't want the economy to stall, and so they conceded on some basic labor rights. But that concession only came about because workers were willing to strike to achieve their demands. It's also important to note that strikers' demands have not always been noble. For example, in 1889, white fishermen in BC struck to limit competition over government-issued licenses from Indigenous peoples and American and Japanese immigrants. Though today many unions are committed to challenging racism and other forms of discrimination, these are significant issues that have long divided working people, and much work remains to be done. Another spike in worker militancy and strike action occurred during World War I. Workers wanted their fair share of the booming wartime profits resulting from the goods and services they were providing. But strikes during the war were not always about wages. Some were called to back political demands, for example, to protest conscription and to push for government intervention in the economy to reduce inflation. The use of strikes spiked again during World War II. In fact, 1943 was one of the most turbulent years in Canadian labor history. The mounting pressure on employers in the state eventually pushed the federal government to pass legislation in an attempt to end workplace disruption and to ensure continued production during and after the war. The labor legislation put in place at the end of the war sought to contain the power of working class protest. So a key part of the new legislation was limiting when and how workers could engage in strikes. In exchange for such things as compulsory dues checkoff and grievance procedures, unions had to refrain from engaging in illegal or wildcat strikes, and union leaders had to repudiate such actions when they occurred. Though the new labor legislation sought to limit workers' use of the strike and contain labor militancy, since then, workers have continued to use the strike to fight for economic and political gains. In 1976, over 1 million workers across Canada participated in a one-day general strike against federal wage controls imposed by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Between 1995 and 1998, workers in Ontario protested the austerity measures of Conservative Premier Mike Harris by engaging in a series of one-day demonstrations and general strikes known as the Days of Action. More recently, in Alberta, in the past few years, there's been talk of a general strike to protest the provincial government's attacks on public sector workers. Still, the number of strikes has definitely decreased in recent decades, as attacks by employers in the state on workers have increased. As in the past, today, employers and governments use a variety of tools and mechanisms to avoid strikes and to contain them when they do occur. And I'd like to highlight a couple of these tactics. So one of the ways that employers try to limit the effects of strikes is to keep production going. In some cases, managers will attempt to do the work of striking employees, but that can be difficult depending on the size of the workplace and the work involved. So instead, some employers hire replacement workers. Employers often target people desperate for work and offer them good wages. Replacement workers who cross picket lines are sometimes referred to as scabs. Striking workers and other members of the labor movement look down on these workers as undercutting the power of the strike. Although employers claim that bringing in replacement workers is just helping them serve their customers and not hindering negotiations, the decision to use replacement workers can actually ratchet up tensions, making it more difficult to reach a resolution. Another method for containing strike activity is back to work legislation. Back to work legislation is a special law passed by the government that orders an end to a labor management dispute. It ends a strike or lockout by either imposing a binding arbitration process on the two parties or a new contract without negotiation. Back to work legislation was first used in August 1950, after Canada's railway unions launched a nationwide strike. Without the freight trains, there were fears that factories would be unable to ship their goods to market and store shelves could go empty. On August 29th, Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent introduced a bill that ordered an end to the strike and imposed a process for settling the dispute between the workers and the rail companies. Within days, the railway workers were back on the job. In recent years, there's been a major change in the frequency and severity of back to work legislation in Canada. Since the early 1980s, the number of instances of back to work legislation is higher than any other period in Canadian history. In the last 3 decades, the federal government alone passed 20 pieces of back to work legislation, and provincial governments have enacted more than 70. Most of this legislation not only forced workers back to work after taking strike action, but also arbitrarily imposed settlements. Businesses and governments often justify back to work legislation by saying that it's an emergency situation. However, like with the use of replacement workers, back to work legislation can worsen the situation in the workplace, as it alleviates pressure on the employer to bargain and often fails to address important issues that forced workers onto the picket line in the first place. As well, while the government portrays itself as a neutral third party in these situations, the resumption of business definitely benefits one group, employers, over the other, workers, which raises questions about whether the state is an impartial umpire in labor relations. Though workers and unions can challenge back to work legislation in the courts, such cases take a great deal of time and money, making it very difficult for many groups to pursue them. Still, for those that do, sometimes they win. In 2016, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers won a huge victory when the Ontario Superior Court ruled that the former federal Conservative government infringed the Charter freedom of association of union members and their freedom of expression when it passed back to work legislation during a Canada Post labor dispute in 2011. Though the ruling is a significant victory, it took 5 years to achieve. As well, it hasn't stopped the government from using back to work legislation to stop postal workers from striking, which is exactly what happened in 2018. So while court cases may be less disruptive than strikes, they take much longer, require substantial resources, and don't necessarily achieve workers' demands. So this issue of time and money and who has more of it relates to another tactic that employers use to defeat strikes: waiting. Many employers choose to wait workers out, hoping that workers will become desperate enough to accept concessions or quit to take another job. History is rife with examples of lengthy strikes that drag on, with workers trying to make ends meet on strike pay and donations from the community. For example, in 2017, workers at the Chronicle Herald newspaper in Halifax were on strike for 19 months before reaching a deal with their employer. They eventually signed an agreement that saw half of their members laid off and a 5% wage cut across the board. So long strikes are a reminder that although the strike is a powerful tool for workers, it doesn't always lead to a worker victory. As well, like with court cases, it's often easier for employers, especially in the case of large companies, to wait out a strike compared to workers, many of whom live paycheck to paycheck. So to conclude, although many people think of strikes in narrow economic terms, only as a way for unionized workers to get more money, history shows us that all kinds of workers have used strikes to protest a variety of injustices, both at work and beyond, and at times that they've made significant gains when they did. In the case of the strike here at U of M, while the provincial government may find it convenient to argue that the strike is simply a financial dispute between UMFA and the university administration, the reality is that this strike, like many strikes, is about much more than that. It's about defending workers' rights and university autonomy. It's about stopping government attacks on education, healthcare, and collective bargaining, and so much more. UMFA members know this. Students know this. And the government and university administration also know this. This is why they're refusing to withdraw the wage mandate and why they're refusing to engage in meaningful negotiations. They know that a fair deal for UMFA members will help other public sector workers in their struggles to improve their wages and working conditions, and that a successful strike will motivate other people in the province to work together to push back against injustice. Indeed, it's important to note that the gains made from strikes don't just take the form of wage increases and new clauses in a collective agreement. Win or lose, with every strike, workers and their supporters gain valuable knowledge and experience that they carry forward into their next action, organization, or movement. As Quebecois labor and feminist activist Madeleine Perrant once stated, every labor battle teaches a worker how to fight. Nothing is ever completely lost. We don't yet know how the strike here at U of M will end, but we know that as a community, we've already gained valuable organizing experience and important knowledge about the power of cross-campus solidarity. As students supporting UMFA spokesperson Travis Huney recently stated, no matter what happens with the strike itself, which is obviously our main focus, at the end of the day, there are now upwards of 50 students in our group that have organizing experience and probably a better understanding of labor issues. More students are going to feel empowered to use their voice and collective power the next time that the ruling class is trying to screw with them. These are important developments that will shape our campus and community in the years to come. First, though, we continue to strike to win. So I hope you'll join me and my fellow UMFA members out on the picket line. Thank you. So I'll hand things back over to Gabrielle, who's kindly agreed to host our question and discussion session. And I'll stop sharing here.
And I believe we can also stop recording.